We've been hearing about this morning some of the issues of technology and weaponry that some would argue is these days much better targeted. It's what we're hearing from Spain, from the UK, about some of the weaponry going to Saudi Arabia. It's better targeted, it's more accurate, it's able to cut down or cut out civilian casualties. Of course, it's fewer casualties for the combatants who are actually operating these technologies in some ways. But of course, a lot of these claims depend very much on the willingness of those using them to avoid civilian casualties. And of course, I'm not convinced that any of us really believe that much of this weaponry is anything like as accurate as it's claimed to be. And that when we look at the moment about questions of willingness to avoid civilian casualties, I want to look a little bit maybe at the moment at Yemen, where both UNICEF and Save the Children warned just this week, indeed warned again yesterday, that the escalation in fighting around Yemen's key port city could put thousands of children in the line of fire, further choke the delivery of food and medicine to a country already on the brink of famine. That Save the Children staff in the port city reported almost 100 airstrikes over last weekend, 5 times as many as in the whole of the month of October. And that we've also been having reports that the Houthi fighters have also been stationing snipers on the roof of the hospital, so that we're seeing the hospital there becoming a key point. We know that more than 20 million people in Yemen are in need of humanitarian assistance. Many have nowhere to go. They are trapped by conflict. And again, the UN's Sexual and Reproductive Health Agency said recently that the famine looming over Yemen will be the worst potentially in the world's recent history, and that's saying something, putting up to 2 million pregnant and lactating women at risk of death. Nearly half of the country's health facilities are no longer functioning, including those that were providing reproductive health services. And that for those that manage to get out, well, sanctuary is not assured. We saw in July this year over 500 Yemeni asylum seekers landing in a resort island in South Korea, and seeing a real sort of pushback from the Korean public. Disappointingly, much of that youth-led, basically arguing these people have no right to be there. Where else have we heard this? And of course, Yemen, we should also remember, is a country with 250,000 Somalis who've also sought refuge there. So you can see the ripple effect on the movement of people from conflict. According to the International Organization on Migration at the moment, there reckon to be something like 244 million international migrants globally. It's about 3.3 of the world's population. It's been relatively stable since figures were collected. The numbers have increased because, of course, the world's population is increasing. And while so you can see that the vast majority of people in the world stay in the country in which they were born. And that most who migrate within their region, and the overwhelming majority move for work purposes. So let's do a little bit of myth busting there. This is work purposes, people moving mainly in their region. This is not an invasion. This is not, any of the things that we are currently hearing from Trump, and I think distressingly from a number of governments in the European Union. But global displacement, people who have not made a choice to move, is at a record high. And it's currently estimated about 68 million people displaced globally. 40 million of those internally displaced. So we're looking at global populations, and we're looking at refugee numbers, and those displaced, across borders. I think we need to get an idea about the perspective of this, that while the numbers are large, they are nothing like the sort of all these water-based sort of metaphors that you get, these waves or tsunamis or whatever that people would have us believe. And where are these people going? That of those who do cross borders, and it's about 20 million, Turkey at the moment hosts about 3.5 million. Uganda, 1.5. Pakistan, 1.5. These are official figures, right? The reality may be something different. Lebanon, about 1 million. Iran, about 1 million. And Bangladesh, now, of course, with the Rohingya crisis, a similar number. You will notice a number of countries that are missing from that list of the top countries, top receiving countries. The UK is not in it. The US is not in it. And the most of the overwhelming majority of people who are crossing borders seeking sanctuary are going to low and middle income countries. We're seeing broken governance in many of those countries, and in many of them as well, where you have that broken governance, you have the space for other bodies to grow. If we look at Iraq, for example, you can see that after the invasion by coalition forces, an increasing fracturing along sectarian lines, and that after war broke out in neighbouring Syria, ISIS taking advantage of the societal tensions, grievances in the region and moving in. So that in addition to that first tragedy for Iraq, which saw child malnutrition rising, which saw at one point something like 70% of children estimated to be in need of psychological support. Hardly surprising when you consider what was happening there, what our country contributed to. A crash in the health service. And then you get ISIS moving in with a further displacement of more than 3 million Iraqis since the start of 2014. Many now living in harsh conditions in camps or unfamiliar towns with limited access to schools and jobs, and of course refugees moving to other countries. The International Rescue Committee says that families have been displaced as many as 2 or 3 times, traumatized children packed into overcrowded schools or who work on the streets to help support their families, and girls are particularly vulnerable and at risk of abuse and early marriage. And of course, during the activities of ISIS there, mass executions, systematic rape, horrendous acts of violence were widespread. And it's estimated that even now 11 million Iraqis in need of humanitarian assistance. And we saw, of course, a movement to the Kurdistan part of Iraq, which was felt to be more stable. And at the moment, 1 in every 4 of the population there is either a refugee or internally displaced. So think about what that is doing to the governance of the area. And we may have our views about the governance of the area, but nevertheless, you know, you've got communities, you've got authorities, infrastructure at breaking point. And the horrors mount up. We've been hearing again, just in the last few days, about the finding of even more mass graves. So we're now looking at a known existence of 202 mass grave sites of various sizes, mainly in northern Iraq. And Afghanistan, another area that, you know, we're seeing a considerable number of refugees still coming from there, about 2.5 million registered refugees. We know it's a lot more than that from Afghanistan, that comprising the largest protracted refugee population in Asia, the second largest refugee population in the world. And what we're hearing is that violence is still forcing people from their homes. The Norwegian Refugee Council estimating that every day it's about 1,200 new people forced to flee violence and unrest. And of course, what you're now seeing as well with Afghanistan is that all of the destabilization there, all of the ongoing programs, There are now also, because of pushbacks in neighbouring states, not least Pakistan, Afghanistan is receiving something like 300,000 returned refugees each year. And in conversations that I've had with the Iraqi ambassador in Brussels, he says that this is an immensely destabilising factor in the country, that, you know, the country cannot cope with people coming back. And again, hearing this week from one children's body looking at the returns of refugees, kids being returned there from the EU, from the UK, it's still part of the EU for the next few months, still being returned there with virtually no services on return, off the plane, there you go, kids. And what do you expect is going to happen? So, you know, 7 out of 10 refugees returning to Afghanistan become internally displaced in their own countries due to conflict and violence. So when you've got this going on, is it any wonder that people try and move to cross borders to actually find some sort of safety? And what do they find en route? Gangs, smugglers, exploitation, facilitating travel across the Mediterranean is really big business in Libya, another country devastated by conflict. And in Niger, much of the exploitation of migrants who find themselves there, partly due to the EU's horrendous policies at the moment, are men who were formerly involved in conflict. This is their new money-making way of survival. People facing violence across the whole route, not least at the borders, and children born en route may find themselves stateless as their births aren't registered or their mothers can't pass on nationality. Children go missing, particularly unaccompanied minors, and it's feared that many fall victim to human traffickers. We know that many children, girls and boys, basically sell sex en route in order to be able to survive. Their education's disrupted, if it's even started. Many young girls faced early marriage to provide a degree of safety, with all the risks of health that can go with that. And mental health facilities non-existent or under enormous strain. There are approximately 28.5 million primary school-aged children out of school in conflict-afflicted areas. So we've got all of this. The human cost is horrendous. The political implications should be of enormous concern. And that is, before we add now as well the challenges of climate change, which are also exacerbating conflict. It's part of the issue in central Nigeria at the moment between farmers, herdsmen, that, you know, if governance can't cope with that, with those additional challenges, you know, we are in, I think, a desperate state. And the chances of making Sustainable Development Goals 16 on peace, justice and strong institutions, it's a nice ambition, but it's going to need a hell of a lot more work. So when we're talking about war, conflict, when we're talking about the new weaponry, etc., that's coming into it, we have to remember the human costs on the ground. And it's part of building that humanitarian approach to actually combat this, which I think is of enormous importance for all of us. Thank you.